Hello and welcome to Performance Load Testing Basics, the webinar series that we have created and now compiled into a single recording for you. What we're going to do is just touch on who the webinar is for and then get into a quick overview of Apica, and then we will get right into the recorded webinars, each of which is about 15 minutes. It starts with recording user scenarios, followed by post-processing those recordings, and then preparing for the execution of load testing, and then finally executing load tests. Let's start by just addressing who this webinar is designed for. We have designed the series of webinars to help the folks who would be relatively new to testing. You might be from the development organization, QA, operations, or part of a DevOps team, and you have either limited experience doing load testing directly yourself, or you may be returning to it after some time. And so you might be launching a product or a service, you might be experiencing significant growth, you might be adopting a DevOps approach, or any number of reasons that would allow you to need to refresh your understanding and get some best practice information under your belt for how to do basic load testing. So what we hope you'll get out of this will be allow you to get your head in the game and provide you with access to a lot more resources that can help you to be successful along the way. And just a bit about us. Apica provides comprehensive performance testing and monitoring tools to among the largest players and brands around the globe. We have the largest testing and monitoring network available, and battle-tested tools and professionals that we deploy against all manner of situations that our clients bring us into. We have, we were founded in 2005. We have over 500 customers worldwide, employees and offices in Stockholm, Santa Monica, and New York. So please do check us out, and we're here to help. And part of how we are helping our users is by way of our what we call the ZebraTester community. And please do check out, if you haven't already signed up, please do so. We have quite a variety of information on tools, tips, best practice information, and discussions that are free to you to use and to learn through your experiences and sharing with the community. So please do check us out on the community. And now I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Hi, my name is Daniel Frey and I'm the community manager for ZebraTester. Today we're going to walk through how to create user scenarios, or rather the different ways of recording them. Coming up in the series, we're also going to look at post-processing user scripts, uploading scripts and running them with loads, and also short tips around how you can improve your web performance. But today we're going to focus on recording user scenarios. And there's a few different ways that we can do this. We can either go the route with the Firefox HAR file that we record in the browser and import into ZebraTester. The second way we're going to look at is converting Selenium scenarios in the load-test portal. And the third is going to be a ZebraTester recording on a network level. And that is actually the one we're going to start with. So I'm going to switch to my ZebraTester instance. It looks like this. And to record something here, there's a few prerequisites that you need. One, you will need ZebraTester installed locally on your computer or in the cloud. Two, you'll need a ZebraTester recording add-on for Firefox. And third, we do recommend that you use Firefox for this, as it's also a prerequisite for the recorder add-on. So to get started with this, all I need to do is have a website, have ZebraTester installed and running, and all I need to do then is click play on the recording add-on. That will automatically set the browser to localhost proxy, and we will be able to record any traffic coming over. So if I go to this blog website that we set up to play around with, after pushing play, all I need to do is type in my actions that I'm going to perform on the website. So let's add 1 for the first load, and let's load the page. As I'm loading the page, you will see in the add-on bar that more and more items are being recorded. And once the load is done, I can start thinking about my next step. So I'm going to perform a search on this website. Adding the page break, and then I'm interacting with the function to perform a search. I'm executing the search and waiting until I get the result. And I add the third page break called open article. So we now have a recorded transaction that opens up the landing page, performs a search, and then opens up the article in the result. This is one way of doing it, and we can see that we do get all the requests here, and all that is left is just post-processing, removing third-party domains that aren't going to be part of the test, or handling dynamic variables by performing parameterization, or as some other tools call it, correlation. So this is one way of doing it, and all that's left is just removing the calls that you don't want, and then you can run the test. The second way of recording a test is utilizing HAR files. To do this, I'm gonna press F12 on my keyboard, and that's gonna open up the Firefox developer tools. I'm also gonna make sure that I have it configured correctly by opening up the preferences for this, and I make sure that enable persistent logs is enabled, because I want to keep all the resources that I load for every page view. Go back to the network bar and then start interacting with the website. Just the exact same way that we just did. Load the start page, wait a few seconds, perform the search, wait another few seconds, and click the article. Now the big reason why we waited a few seconds in every step is that we want to have an offset between the requests, so that we have a small time window before and after a page has been loaded, so we can isolate them. So once again, the scenario is already done. So I'm going to save the HAR file. And name it WordPress.har. So when I save this, I just need to go back to the ZebraTester main menu, click on the project navigator, and I will then have the file in front of me, WordPress.har. All I need to do now is import this into ZebraTester, and we then have the recording. The only remaining steps is adding the page breaks. And I do this by isolating where the offsets are. So all I need to do is locate the search request and verify that this is where the offset is located. And I'll just add the perform search page break. Now when that is done, all you need to do is save the file, remove the different hosts that you aren't interested in, and handle the parameterization. And just to give a quick window into how that works, I enter the var handler, and these are all the requests that we want. So usually before you go into this part, you filter the hosts to ensure that you only have the host that you want to test. When this is done, I go back into the var handler, and I can then limit, this window is then limited to showing only the variables that I need to handle on this specific domain. In this case, all of these values are representing versioning of my CSS files or JavaScript files. And I just need to click here to handle them. And ZebraTester does this automatically. But this is not the focus for today. We're going to cover this more in the post-processing part. So once I'm done with this, I can just reset the recordings after having saved it. But the third and absolutely easiest way of doing this is by using Selenium IDE scripts and converting those in the load test portal for a quick and easy load test. And to do this, we need to open Selenium IDE, add a test case, and I'm going to go into my WordPress folder and choose a pre-existing one. Now this test performs the exact same steps that I did in all my recordings so far. It opens up the landing page, it performs a search, and it opens up the target article. So to illustrate that, I'm going to open up this page, and I'm going to change the Selenium script to slow. I'm going to play it. So what happens in the background is that it opens up the website and starts interacting with the elements on the website. Verifies that everything is there and present. So there's the search. And then it opens up the article and verifies that the article is correctly generated. So I can take this test and just upload it to the Apica Lotus portal. So when I go to the Apica Lotus portal, it presents me with a project view. To do the conversion of this test, all I need to do is go into load test, new test. And my session expired, so I'm just logging in again. And when I am at the correct view, I just choose Selenium. And I do have a pre-existing scenario uploaded. It's exactly the same scenario that I have recorded locally. Let's just upload this file again though, to get the correct process of it. I just go into my tests, my ZebraTester folder where I have saved the file. And there we got it, blog.mecha.sc. Let's just rename this one. Call it rev1. And then upload that file and save it. So now we have it listed in this create load test view. So I'm just going to select this one and create a runnable load test file from it. So that's going to launch the browser in the background and record all the requests that are needed to run this test, even the third-party ones. And it also gives us the chance to do post-processing here. When it's captured all the calls, it gives me a few questions here. Do I want to run this in a parallel mode or a sequential mode? The difference between those two are only that parallel suits better for websites, where sequential fits better with APIs. The think time is just there to configure the tests with the correct pause between steps. And the variance is just there to provide some variation to the think time, so it's not always uniform, reflecting the real world a bit more. Then I click next, and all I need to do is post-processing once again, the same way that we did it in ZebraTester. We just define which domain we want to keep and press the keep button, and that will delete all the requests that are coming from third parties. And I do this on each step. And when this is done, this is now a pure test against my own domain, and I will not touch anyone else's domain. So all I need to do is click generate load test. It will then generate the class file and take me to the configuration page, where I can simply just choose a pre-existing configuration and execute it. But this is something that we're going to show you more of in the next webinar, but It's a very simple operation of just creating these tests and then running them. And you can create these methods against any website as long as you have information about how that website works. So to end it, with some tips and recommendations around scenario creation to help you with this. So after you've done all of the recordings, you will need to dig into user models to find out the behavior, to find out how much time should be spent on each page, and also prepare your test data to make sure that you have all those logins or all those searches to be able to drive the test. And we always recommend that start small with simple tests and start building up your test bank more and more as time goes on, unless you learn more about your application. This way you will isolate performance needs in your application, and you won't get stuck on too much of a high level if you start with more granular tests like perform search, login, or post a comment, for example. But you can also do transactions that goes through a whole user transaction, performing a purchase on an e-commerce website. And always put some time down to clearly define what the pass and fail conditions are. When is a load test result bad and when is it good? When can you move on to the next test? I hope this helps you in creating a test with Apica ZebraTester, and that it enables you to run more load tests in our Apica load test portal. And thanks for your time. Welcome back. Last topic we covered was recording user scenarios, and today's topic is going to be post-processing those recordings. But before we move on to that, just a quick recap of what we did last time. Last time we covered how to import a Firefox HAR file, that's a HTTP archive file, into ZebraTester. And we also went through how to convert a Selenium IDE test into a load test. And last, how to do different recordings using ZebraTester, for example, on a network level or using a definition file. But today we're going to cover post-processing this recording that we did last time. We're going to use the same scenario, and the different parts of the post-processing that we're going to cover is parameterization, which is modifying a recording scenario to be able to use it in a load test. It can be that a dynamic date is needed to be able to book a flight. It can also be that you want to make a search dynamic, that you want to provide data to that search from an input file, or handling versions of JavaScript. We're also going to cover content and response verification. So an example is when you add something to a cart on an e-commerce platform and then open that cart, you want to verify that the product is actually added there and present. After that, we're also going to look at think and pass times. I'm going to talk a little bit about why these are important and what you can base these times on. And last, we're going to cover what objectives are we reaching with the post-processing that we just done. Because each scenario can achieve specific test objectives. For example, you can have an answer to the question, how many searches can I perform per minute? Or how many concurrent users can I have on the website at a given time? Or how many connections can our network infrastructure handle? All of these tests have different configurations, usually the same recording, but configured differently. So let's get started. So in front of me I have ZebraTester again, and I'm going to go into the project navigator. I'm going to open up the WP search raw, and that's the recording that we used last time. So if you can see here, it's still going against the same target. We don't have any think times configured, and it's all one long session. So I'm just going to start modifying this session to make it represent what I actually wanted to do. Now this is a test that goes to a blog. It performs a search, and it opens up one of the hits in that search. So first of all, I isolate the search step, and I create a page break here. After that, I isolate where the article is first loaded and add my second page break. So when this is done, I essentially have 3 page views: loading of the landing page, loading execution of the search, and opening of the article. When I have all these page breaks done, I just want to configure the think times. Now I'm making a stress test in this case, so I'm fine with just a 3-second think time. And I'm going to add a variation of 35% to this. So now each step has a 3-second pause time and a 35% variation. And these pause times, they represent time spent on page. If you want to make this a realistic test, you can also say that the whole transaction of this test represents the session time for a user to complete the transaction. And these think times are very important. If I would change this to just arbitrarily number like 30 seconds, then I might completely miss the kind of load that I want to put on my website with that kind of test. Because right now, if I increase the think time by double, I'm going to halve the amount of transactions. If I decrease the think time to 1.5 seconds, I'm going to get double the throughput, theoretically. So think times is a very important step in kind of what load are you putting on the system. So, and how to describe think time in ZebraTester is that it's the time we wait before we perform an action. And you should never have a 0-second think time unless it's absolutely necessary. And all recordings start with 0-second think time. So remember this. When this is done, we're going to take a look at the content verification. And this is to actually verify that the steps we perform have the correct responses to them. So if I perform a search for proxy sniffer, which is the old name for ZebraTester, I expect a hit on the article search to contain an article having proxy sniffer in the title or in its content. But we also see here that we're doing a lot of size verifications. And this can cause a lot of false positives unless you know what you do. So we're going to disable all content verification and just add what we need. And to disable content verification, just uncheck verify content up here. You decide to do this in all URLs. And in this case, and then select that it's the content you want to change for all of these, and then apply. This will disable the content verification all over, but we still need to add this or it's not going to be a proper test. So first of all, when I'm opening up blog.mecha.se, I want to verify that there's at least one article present containing text proxy sniffer. When I perform the search, I also want to do a verification like this, but we're going to come back to that in a bit. And when it comes to the article we open, we always want to verify the title of this. And I can just select this from the proposed text strings that ZebraTester defines. So I select multiple proxy sniffer installations on OS X, and that's now how we're going to verify that we got the correct response. So before I do the last one, we're going to do some parameterization. And in parameterization is also called correlation in some tools. It's the process of making dynamic data dynamic. It can be that you need to extract and assign a user session somewhere. It can also be that you're assigning usernames or passwords to a login. Or in our case, the handling of JavaScripts, versioning. So when we look at what we recorded here, we have a lot of JavaScript and CSS files containing a query parameter called ver. That stands for version, and then a version number. The danger here is that if I would run this test without handling these versions, there's a big chance that I will download the wrong JavaScript or CSS file. This can be that I will miss that a CSS file has grown so much that it's becoming a network problem. It can also be that I will get a lot of 404s requesting files that are no longer there. So let's handle this. And I'm going to go into the var finder for this. And this will list all the parameters it finds. We can even see the proxy sniffer search term that I used when I recorded this test last time. And everything else is just versions. So you can classify all these variables into two groups. The automatically generated ones by the website and the user input ones. The automatically generated ones that comes from the HTML, we can just dynamically and automatically assign this by clicking one of these buttons. It will then find where these values are, extract them, and rewrite the request. So the next time that I'm requesting the website, I might get 4.4.4 instead of 4.4.3. But we also see that the proxy sniffer value here is unhandled. And to handle this, because this is not a value that comes from pre-generated HTML, we need to go to the request for this. When we open up the request, I just need to scroll down to add the input file. I just need to also verify that what I want to change is present in this page. And in this case, we want to make the search more dynamic. We want to select from a list of different search terms and use that list to search for the articles. So we start by adding an input file, and in this case we're going to use a CSV file as comma delimited. Contains two values. We're going to do a new line per loop, meaning that when every test is done, it will start again and pick from a new line. So I've added a file, and I need to just create a variable and tie it together. So I'm just going to call it search. And we can see now that it fetches all the values from column 1 to this search variable. And I've added the input file, and the input file can be verified in this manner. And this is how it will look in a test. It only contains 2 rows, but we'll then span them in this view and represent how the test would act. So if I would start 10 users, it would fetch these 10 first lines and make them for the first loop. And then whenever user completes, it will go down 1 line in the test. So let's tie the value that I want to rewrite, and in this case I want to rewrite the search query parameter. So I'm gonna click on this button up in the top left in the request header window. It's gonna get me to the assign of CG parameter view. So I verify that the value I want to change is present and the parameter is there, and then I just select the variable I just created and say fetch values from here. So when that is done, it gives us a view that tells us how this fetch works. It's taking a value from the input file wp search keywords.csv, and it rewrites the URI of request number 27. In this case, it rewrites the proxy sniffer value. Now that we've assigned a dynamic search here, we can do a pretty cool thing, that we can go back a few steps. We can go down to the perform search step and go into the view for content verification. Now if I go in here, I can actually replace the pre-recorded one, select it from the search value. That means that we'll dynamically verify this page depending on what search was performed. So if I search for multiple, I expect multiple to be present as a search term on this page. And if I would have searched for proxy sniffer, I expect that to be present there as well. And then I click apply. So we've now configured most of the basic stuff in order to be able to run a load test. We've created a simple stress test that loads a start page, performs a search, and then loads an article. Next steps for this is some tips. So when you're starting doing this by yourself against your own website, you should always think about these 5 tips. Always choose a simple recording to start, or even be more granular and start with your APIs to benchmark the throughput of those. Because at the end, those are the ones that are going to be deciding how quick a user can operate on your front-end interface. And always identify 1 or 2 goals so you can shape your test to answer these questions. And the act of parameterization should never be underestimated. it's what makes the test dynamic and be able to be scaled up to be used with 10,000 users, for example. So you want to have 10,000 user accounts, for example, if you do that. So load your recordings, identify and modify all the parameters you can find that are important for the test. And always verify expected results and choose the appropriate think times. And I'll repeat this again. If you're looking for the pause time or think time for a page, that's the time spent on page in Google Analytics. And if you're looking for what the full session length of a test should be, you should verify that it's not taking too long, for example. You can also look at the session duration or length in your analytics tools. Hello and welcome to the third installment of this webinar series. Last time we spoke about post-processing recordings, and today we're going to speak about some load test preparation basics. And before we start with that, we're going to take a look at a quick recap. So last time we spoke about parameterization, which is modifying a request so it works in the future, that it actually acts as it should. It can be a dynamic date, it can be extracting a username for later use, or simply changing the host name. We also spoke about content and response verification. And that's where you verify that you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing. If you add an item to a cart, you want to verify that the item is present in the cart. And third, we spoke about think and pause times and how important these are. And also objectives. And we're going to be touching a lot more of objectives today. So let's move on to that and not cover that point that much. So before you start doing your load testing, you should always do some preparations, define your goals and what questions you want to answer to. And some of these questions can be: how much overhead will switching to HTTPS add? How can we verify our service level agreements? It can be for troubleshooting, for isolating the root cause for a problem that's been occurring the last few days. And all of these are important to hammer out in the beginning, before you even start designing your tests, because they will always influence how you're testing and what you're testing. For example, if you're having a problem with login, you might want to stress the login function to just isolate a problem. But if you're switching technologies, you want to verify that you're not getting a degradation of performance or running into any new problems. And these will change the test. For example, the login problem is best applied with stress testing. So let's take a look at some more tips, and before we go too deep into methodology, let's talk about that. So for example, stress testing is usually used for isolating bottlenecks or measuring transaction throughput. So in the login problem context, this makes sense to do, just stressing the login function to find out where it breaks. But then we also have concurrency testing, which helps you scale your environment properly or just verify that you can handle a specific load. It can be used to just validate a new installation of your environment. This installation is supposed to handle 400,000 users. Can it do that? And that question goes into concurrency testing. There's a lot of different methodologies used. We're going to cover a few of them here. And all of these methodologies will have their own configuration. So this is something you can prepare ahead of time. You can create these configurations to reflect the test methodologies you're going to use. And that's going to make more sense when we look at how these test methodologies are built up. But something else that you also need to think about is how to document what you're going to do. Like, what are you testing? How are you testing it? Is this going to break something else? What kind of scope? Do we want to test up to 10,000 users, or do we need to go to 20,000? Do we need to test for one full week or just one day to verify a single change? And are there any limitations or risks involved in this? And then what test data requirements. For example, if you're stress testing a login function to find out where it's going wrong, you can't use one account, you need to use as many as possible. It might be an edge case that triggers this, so if possible, create a snapshot, anonymize all the data, and run the test using those users. Dump them all into a big CSV file with username and password, and just stress it out. And all of this documentation will also make sense in a bit, because you shouldn't only just talk about or talk about this load test or document it for yourself. Because the more people you involve in your load test, the more value you will start adding to your load test. So for example, if you're doing a load test from a development standpoint, it might be good to talk to the operations team and have them participate in that, not just clear it. Because they will learn what happens when you put the system under this controlled stress, and they might have some input on some other things that they want to test. I'm going to talk more about that in the later part of this webinar. But let's take a look at some load test methodologies. So these are some common test types. If you look at the graphs on the left, they kind of look the same, but still not. So for example, in this case, we're looking at a stress test in the top left corner. And what we do here is we just burst for 5 minutes, for example, quickly from 0 to 10,000 users or more, to just verify if the system can handle that spike in traffic and how it copes with the transaction throughput. Now these tests are very good to verify how robust it is, and it can be a live drill for an operations team because it's so sudden, but it will also highlight all the bottlenecks in your system. So it's a really good test to just run against, for example, a login function to find out where in the system does it go wrong. Do we get a hotspot in CPU somewhere, or do we just need to scale up the database in order to cope with all the logins? Then we also have the concurrency here. Now, we have a much more slower ramp up there, as you can see. And that's because we really don't want to stress the system until we reach our desired goal. And if the system goes down in this kind of small ramp up in the bottom left, then the test is kind of failed. So the most important here is to simulate concurrency test to reality. Make them as close as possible. You want to ramp up for 20 minutes or even an hour, depending on how many users you need to get into the system, so you don't shock it. And then you want to measure, maybe an hour or two in, what levels are the system at? Are the environment handling the load? And does this adhere to an SLAs that we've agreed with the hosting provider? So concurrency testing is really good for simulation tests. You can absolutely base a lot of data. You can base the test on a lot of data, like time spent on pages, session times, and reflect your Google Analytics and perform mixed tests with concurrency testing. It's really good for real-world scenarios. Now, if we want to take those two test types one step longer, we can do a stress series, where we start with maybe from 0 to 1,000 users. After that, we go to 0 to 2,500 users, and just keep on ramping the load up. Now this will shock the system each test, but it will also show how does it handle that stress, and then increase it and then increase it until something breaks. And that's when you start finding a lot of bottlenecks and problems. So it's really good to just do this kind of test maybe once a month and verify if there's anything new to learn. And the last thing is a variation of the concurrency thing, but rather than being interested in after we've ramped up, this is more of just a complete ramp up from 0 to 10,000 users, and then it stops. And this is a kind of test where you just want to run it for an hour, slowly climb up, and then mark when does it fail. This will most likely be the limit of whatever your testing is handling. This is a really good test to just start learning about your environment, and actually running this one before the concurrency test, which is still a bit more normal test. And going back, so I've added a small tagline to all of these tests. So stress testing is good for measuring change. Currency testing is good for simulation tests. The stress series is good for finding issues with your environment. And ramp is good for finding limits. So these are some easy tools you can make use of when you're doing load testing to help you find things and they'll validate your environments. And there are many more ways of testing your systems than this. It's all about defining what question do you want to answer. Is it how has the environment changed since the last test? Or in concurrency say, can we handle this kind of traffic in the future, or do we need to scale up? And going back to stress series again, it's just good for finding issues. And ramping is really good for finding the system's limits. So you've picked your test, you've picked your questions and goals, and it's also that you need to prepare your environment a bit. How can you get as much value from this load test as possible? So a few of these things are: make sure that you have a APM tool installed. It can be App Dynamics or New Relic or even Dynatrace. Just if you have one of these tools installed, even the New Relic trial, which is only valid for a week, it will tell you where in the code is these issues coming from, or is it maybe a database issue. They will help you pinpoint things so much more, and they are an excellent add-on, and we do integrate into most of these products. But also install server-side agents to be able to correlate server metrics like CPU with response time. That's also really good for actually isolating where in your environment to look rather than where in your code to look. And I would say that that is almost half of the load test if you're just thinking about the load test and these agents rather than just APM tools. And always ensure that you have restore points if you're doing a lot of database writes and production. Murphy's Law is always in effect, especially when you're doing something that can be potentially destructive as a load test. So below are some of the integrations that you can make use of. For example, for test optimization, we do a lot of integrations into deployment tools like TeamCity, AWS Code Pipeline, Jenkins, so when you deploy a test is executed. You can also spin up cloud environments, load test from these, and correctly measure everything with App Dynamics and our various integrations into CDN. So these are just some tools that can easily and without that much of a cost add a lot of value to your test, and I recommend looking around these things before you get started. And now we get to the communication part. So as I mentioned before, you shouldn't just talk about this load test within your group. You should involve the development team if you're not that team, or the operations team. Also the marketing team, they might have some input on how to design the tests as close to reality as possible. So if you continue iterating on this, you'll soon have a center of excellence where a lot of your departments are working together on load testing and measuring performance and driving that process. That's going to be really helpful. And the longer you work in this way, the more processes you will get that support you, and load testing will become less of a hassle and just something quick and easy. And very valuable, not to say. So I hope that you've learned something, and thanks and goodbye. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about executing load tests, what to think about, and how to achieve this with our products. And before we do that, however, we're going to do a quick recap of last time's session where we spoke about load test preparation basics. So let's move on to the next slide and cover this a bit. So what we spoke about last time is the importance of defining your questions. So if you're looking to validate a specific SLA, you need to think about how to frame that question in such a term that you can answer it with metrics or by running a very specific test. We also spoke about the different methodologies that exist and are available to use for load testing, as well as how you should prepare your environment. Install your APM tool, verify that agents are reporting CPU metrics, memory metrics, or any custom metric that you have configured and are interested about looking at. And the last part we spoke about was the importance of involving other departments. Your website has more stakeholders than the technical ones, which might have questions that are answered by a load test. Involving them is going to add more value to your test and inform your business more about what you're doing. And all of this comes together to help you getting started with load testing. So let's move to today's topics and cover them and do some practical exercises. So today's topic, as I mentioned, was the basics of executing a load test. Like, what do you need to think about? So let's start talking about the configurations. So we've spoken a lot about different test methodologies. We have stress testing, concurrency testing, kind of like a constant ramp test, and pretty much whatever you can think of. Just because there's not a defined methodology for what you're trying to figure out doesn't mean that you can't do it. And we're also going to be talking about the execution. What should I think about before I start a test? What needs to be in place? And configuration-wise, what needs to be configured. So let's jump into a practical example of this, of how I would configure a stress test, and the things like best practices around this configuration. So I'm going to switch over to the Apica load test portal. And more in details, what we're going to do is we're going to configure first a stress test to show you how this would look, and also a concurrency test with some best practices attached to it of how you should handle running load tests against your CDN-enabled environment. So in the load test portal, I've created a test, uploaded a test historically, and shown you how to do this. But when it comes to the configuration, we haven't touched this subject a lot. So I'm going to choose the test that we created last time. It's going to be this one. And I have prepared configurations ahead of time. So I'm going to choose the 100 virtual users Scandinavia and apply this setting. So the setting that we apply now is going to be a 5-minute test with a 10-second ramp-up time and 100 users. When it comes to these kind of simple and just short tests, you don't have to think about that much. This is a test that you're using to learn as much as possible about the environment. It means that you will have to have as many monitors as possible to find out things like, does the application scale well? Am I using all my CPU resources or memory? Things like that. And configuring this in the Apica load test portal is really simple. So if you want to run a 5-minute stress test, all you have to do is choose the amount of users, your load test duration, which is pretty much always going to be 5 minutes if you're doing this kind of test, but also a specific ramp up. So any one of these values changes the nature of the test quite a lot. So if I want to do some kind of memory leak validation, I would just do a really long test, maybe an hour, and see how memory grows or gets consumed during this test. If I change the ramp-up time very high then after that to say 10 minutes, this has now turned into a concurrency test. Now the concurrency test is also a bit reliant on the configuration in the actual load test session that you're going to execute. So you don't want to run a concurrency test with stress test think times. But outside of that, there's really nothing that limits you. So I always recommend doing the base configuration, a 5-minute test with a 10-second ramp up, 100 users, and then maybe running a multiple sequential test in order to find out where does it stop. So you add more tests like this until you're satisfied that you should run into some kind of issue in one of these thresholds. So we're doing 100 users, 250, 500, and 1000. And as I mentioned, it doesn't take a lot to change the behavior of a test. So this went from a stress test to a concurrency test and then back to a stress test series very quickly. And all you have to do is save the preset after you change the configurations. So you can just start with the base configuration and modify it ahead of time. Now, if you would have done a concurrency test, it would have looked something like this in configuration. 10 minutes load test duration, or actually let's do 60 minutes. And then we want to ramp up for, say, 20 minutes. So this is going to ramp us up to 100 users fairly slowly over a time period of 20 minutes, and then it's going to run the test for 40 minutes. When you run a test like this, you never really think about the response times or values of samples coming from the ramp up, but rather you're interested in what happens after you've ramped up and run the test for a while. This covers a third of the important settings and what to think about when you're running a concurrency test. There's a few more settings that are actually valid across multiple platforms of running tests, and general thinking around these kind of tests where you want to simulate a real-world scenario, for example, which you do a lot with concurrency testing. One of these is to always make sure that you're coming from as many locations as possible, because you're going to run a fairly big test. 100 users is not much, but this is usually run with 10,000 users. And you want to spread these users across as many IP addresses as possible to simulate that they're coming from multiple networks. One way to do this is just to grab all the locations available to you and kind of let the load spread across those load generators. But make sure that you always have as many as possible selected unless it's detrimental to your strategy. After that, there's two more options you want to think about. One is going to be distributing load on all available data centers. That means that if you have 10 locations and you are running 100 users for that test, there's a big chance that just one location is going to be enough for the system. So it will put all the users in that one bucket and run the test from single IP. Checking this function changes that behavior, so it spreads the users across multiple locations instead. So you might only get 10 users per location, but at least you'll use all the locations that you have available to you. And that is important because your load balancers will behave differently depending on how you set this up. Another feature that you really should think about and to be able to make these tests correct is that if you're running the test against your website and you have all the static assets involved in the test to verify that the CDN is doing its job, for example, you don't only want to do this of distributing all users across all the locations, you also want to make sure that every time you do a DNS resolution, it won't use the cached value. It should poll the DNS continuously to be able to spread yourself across the CDN provider's different nodes. And you do this by going into the DNS configuration and entering 127.0.0.1 or your own DNS server, but then checking resolve DNS for each executed loop. So this will help you load test environments that have a CDN attached to it that makes use of DNS round robin load balancing, for example, which is extremely popular for CDN providers that have multiple nodes in one UIP location. These are the 3 things you should think about when you're running the test. So make sure that you spread all users across the test. Make sure that you do a DNS resolution for each test. And never forget that don't run a stress test for a concurrency test like I have configured here now. That's not good. So that's the easy part. That's the configuration part in the Lotus portal. When you're done with it, you just save it, give it a descriptive name, like we've done a configuration here to enable CDN. So we're calling this configuration CDN enabled. And we save it as a new configuration. So if you want to run a load test via continuous integration or kick it off via API now, we have the configuration setting ready to be applied to any test we have. So let's go back to the PowerPoint real quick. So that covers how do I move from theory to practice a bit. Like how do I take a methodology and do a configuration to reflect this. Now you also have to think about what you should think about before you start a test. Yeah, you should configure DNS settings to reflect reality and spread your load across as many locations as possible. But you should also think about things like, are my agents reporting data? Are all different departments involved in the test ready to start observing what happens? And have you cleaned away all the third-party content here? So you don't want to run a 10,000 user test and send 10,000 users towards your Google Analytics instance. Might be legal implications to it, but you're not really interested in something that you can't affect. Is the other part, and it makes it overly complex if you start having to think about the third parties. Those are the things of the configuration and execution part. When it comes to what metrics are important, let's start a test here and see how it looks. So we have this configuration. I'm going to keep this configuration, and I'm going to run 100 users from the global test cluster and just put it into webinar 1, or 4 actually, and then start the test. So before we go back to the live dashboard and take a look at the actual live metrics, so what metrics are important? It depends on what kind of question you want to answer. If you're after the verified network throughput, it's going to be your network throughput that you're going to be looking at a lot, and what response time. And there might also be a part where you find out how big of a response time, or rather of a request, how much is just network. So the things you will be looking for is network latency, and that you're not getting as much throughput as you wanted. And these values can be found straight on the live dashboard as you're running the test. Just give it a second to start here. There we go. So when the test is running, you're going to be looking at a few things. From a network perspective, you want to take a look about how many active users do you have in the test, and how many of those users' connections are waiting for a response. So if you're running a test with a parallel configuration, you want to think about things like, for each user I have 6 threads. That meaning I should never see 600 threads in a waiting state. That means 100% of the users are going to time out. But the things you're going to be looking at is network throughput. It also comes into the pages and URL section when you're looking at these things. For example, out of this CSS, how much of it is just pure network? And because this is being transported from Sweden in this case, this is where I have my server, we're going to see over half of this transaction is just going to be pure network latency. So you want to keep an eye out for any static resources or images or anything really. Doesn't have too much of this layer represented in it. Right now it represents 77 milliseconds out of 120 milliseconds total. And you can also go into the client-side monitoring to figure out, the monitoring agents to figure out how much is each server pushing in terms of megabit transmitted per second or received per second. Because there might not only be a network bottleneck in front of your service, it might be existing inside of your environment between the database and web service, for example. Other things you should look at, absolutely, is CPU values. So in this case, I'm running a very slow test and ramp up, so I haven't hit 100% CPU utilization yet. But any agents you add to this test, when you configure it, is going to show up here. In my case, I only have one server and one agent. But this can be represented by having all the different layers represented, so you know which layer has the bottleneck rather than which server only. And you can have multiple values show up here. And if you go into the monitoring agents part and select a specific agent, you can see more detailed values like I/O wait time and megabit transmitted and received in the same graph. So metrics are important. They are important because they help you figure out why is the response time high. It's because I have a higher network latency. Or why is the response time high? Again, it's because I have a lot of wait for the application to send me the response after I made the network connection. And all of this can be figured out really quickly, as I mentioned, if we go back to the screen, by simply going into the pages and URLs and then expanding one of these requests and dive deeper into it. Like this search, for example. Response header wait time is 254 milliseconds, but in this case network content receive time is only 58 milliseconds. So the majority in this time is being spent in the application. And when you have run your test and you know what metrics you're looking at, it's all about iterating. You've run a test and you run the next test with a higher level if you haven't found the bottleneck yet. And you observe the metrics that are important to make sure that they scale up. And this step is all about just twist and change a setting, rerun the test and see what effect it had. And this is something that should be applied to all kinds of tests. You should always run a test and then, if you need to make a change, rerun the test to see what effect did it have. These are some of the tips that we help our customers with today, and I hope that they're of use to you and that they help you in your work. As always, if you have any load test related questions or ZebraTester related questions, feel free to visit us at community.zebratester.com and ask your questions there, and any of our professional services personnel will answer it as soon as they can. So, just an example of the different questions that will pop up. You will be looking for root causes, you will verify system stability, SLAs, was the product launch okay, was the website still working from a performance perspective after we did this code deploy, how do we reduce risks by maybe doing smaller deploys more often and couple those with continuous integration load testing. You have your baselines. These are all questions that can be answered by running a load test. Either a small load test, a big load test, depending on what question you want to answer. And as always, feel free to jump onto our forums and ask us any questions you have, and we'll do our best to reply as soon as we possibly can. Thank you.